Dr. Leo Sanders was not like other scientists. Where others saw a world of limitations, he saw possibilities. Born in a small town in the heart of England, Leo had always been captivated by the mysteries of the universe. He was the kind of person who would spend hours staring at the stars, asking himself questions that no one else seemed to care about. Why is time so mysterious? Can we change the past? What if we could travel to a different moment in history? These were the kinds of thoughts that consumed his mind. From an early age, Leo was determined to break through the barriers of conventional thinking. His childhood was marked by a restless curiosity, constantly tinkering with gadgets, exploring ancient texts, and experimenting with ideas that no one around him could understand. Why not, he would ask, when questioned about his wild theories. Why not try to change the impossible? By the time he was in his 30s, Leo had earned a reputation as a brilliant, albeit eccentric, scientist. His peers saw him as someone who was always a little too obsessed with the unexplainable, someone who didn't quite fit into the standard academic mold. He had little patience for traditional methods, and would often scoff at what he called stale theories. For Leo, the world was full of questions, and he was determined to answer them, even if it meant breaking every rule in the book. Leo's laboratory was located in a secluded mansion on the outskirts of a quiet town in England. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a cold, grey building surrounded by thick woods. But inside, it was a different world. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with old scientific journals, historical manuscripts, and works of philosophy. The smell of dust mixed with the faint scent of chemicals and the constant hum of machines filled the air. It was here, in this makeshift sanctuary of thought, that Leo worked day and night. His obsession had consumed him for years, but now he was on the brink of his greatest discovery. A time machine was possible, Leo would mutter to himself, pacing back and forth in his lab. Time is not a straight line. It can bend, it can fold, it can be manipulated. Given his options, however, he still had the sense of triumph. For years he had been designing and testing countless theories, building prototypes and running simulations, and now, finally, the machine was ready. The time machine. The device that could send him to any point in history, or even the future. He had calculated every variable, every risk. "I'm ready," he whispered to the empty room. The machine was a curious contraption, a blend of mechanical and electronic components. It looked like something from an old science fiction novel. A large, circular metallic frame with intricate wires and glowing buttons. At the centre was a seat, surrounded by levers and buttons that Leo had spent countless hours perfecting. It was the culmination of his life's work, a machine that could alter the very fabric of time. But there was something Leo hadn't accounted for. His journey would not be one of exploration. It would be a struggle for survival. Leo didn't see it at first. He was too excited, too eager to test his creation. The thought that travelling through time might have dangerous consequences never crossed his mind. "I'm in control," he reassured himself. "Nothing can go wrong." But that would soon change. It was the year 2024 when Dr. Leo Sanders finally activated the time machine. The world outside his lab was bustling, filled with technological advancements, social changes, and the ever-growing uncertainty of the future. Time, to most people, was a relentless march forward. But for Leo, time was a puzzle to be solved. He believed that by travelling to the past, he could understand it better, perhaps even rewrite history itself. He set the machine's coordinates to a pivotal moment in history, the year 1912. A time of great exploration when the world seemed full of endless possibilities. The machine hummed to life, and Leo's heart raced with anticipation. "This is it! I'm about to step into the past!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with excitement. He pressed a button, and in an instant, the world around him vanished. The next thing Leo knew, he was standing in a different time, in the midst of a bustling city square. The streets were lined with horse-drawn carriages, and the buildings were made of brick and stone. The air smelled of coal and fresh bread. He had made it. He was in the past. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. The past was beautiful, untouched by the hands of time. But as Leo wandered through the city, he began to notice small inconsistencies. A man walked by, wearing a hat that hadn't been invented until 20 years later. A woman carried a bag that wasn't made until after the war. The people around him began to behave strangely, as though they were not entirely aware of his presence. "What's going on?" Leo muttered to himself. His excitement began to turn into confusion. "This doesn't seem right." He rushed back to the time machine and tried to return to the present. But when the machine activated, something felt wrong. The air crackled with energy, and the room around him blurred. When the world finally settled, he found himself back in his lab. But it was different. The walls were cracked, the floor was covered in dust, and the machines he had spent years building were nothing but broken remnants. "What happened?" Leo gasped in horror, his hands trembling as he reached for the time machine's control panel. He had returned to a different present, a twisted version of the world he had left behind. Leo had made a terrible mistake. Every time he travelled to the past, it created a dangerous alternate reality. The timelines began to twist and merge, each trip to the past making things worse, and with every change, the present became more chaotic and unrecognisable. The door slammed shut, and Leo drew breath to rest his nervously drawn eyes. It was a conflict Leo hadn't anticipated. The very thing he had hoped would be his greatest achievement, the ability to control time, had instead turned into his worst nightmare. The question now was no longer whether he could change history, but whether he could stop it from destroying the world he knew. "I have to fix this. I have to find a way to make things right," Leo whispered to himself, fear and regret creeping into his voice. But what if there was no way to fix it? What if the damage was already done? Dr. Leo Sanders stood frozen in the centre of his lab, staring at the flickering, malfunctioning time machine. The room seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a hum in the air that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The present, if it could even be called that now, was no longer what it had been. His beautiful, orderly lab had transformed into a broken shell, the machines lying in ruin, the walls cracked and decaying, as if they had aged 100 years in the span of a few seconds. The quiet hum of the time machine was deafening in the otherwise still air, and Leo's heart pounded painfully in his chest. How could this happen? His mind raced, trying to process what he had just experienced. He had returned from the past, 1912 to be precise, and expected things to be the same. But they weren't. Nothing was the same. Ben paced the walkways of sun-protected library, looking for steer car. The walls, smooth to the touch. This wasn't supposed to happen. Leo quickly darted to the control panel, his hands shaking as he adjusted the dials. He pressed a series of buttons, trying to reverse the effects, but nothing happened. His pulse quickened, and he could feel the panic rising in his chest. The walls seemed to close in on him. "I have to fix this." Frantic, Leo grabbed the nearest chair and shoved it aside. He couldn't think straight. The world outside was changing, and he had no control over it. He had done something to mess with time, to change history, but he didn't know what. Suddenly, the sound of the front door creaked open, and Leo's heart stopped. Who could be here? He hadn't invited anyone. He didn't have friends who would just show up. His lab was secluded, far from any other building, and he made sure no one knew about his work. His breath caught in his throat. Was this a result of the time machine malfunction? Had someone, or something, come through with him? "Hello," a voice called out from the doorway. It was shaky and uncertain, but the voice was undeniably human. Leo's eyes widened as he turned toward the source of the voice. He was about to speak when he froze. Standing in the doorway was a man, disheveled, unshaven, and wearing clothing that didn't belong in the 21st century. He wore a coat that seemed to belong in the 1800s, and his hair was messy, as if he had been caught in a storm. The man's wide eyes locked with Leo's, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Who are you?" Leo asked, his voice trembling. It sounded different, more desperate than he intended. "Who is this man? What is going on?" The man blinked, clearly confused. I don't know. I don't know where I am." His voice cracked. He looked around the lab, his face scrunching with confusion. "This isn't London. Where is this? What happened?" Leo's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The man's voice, the confusion in his eyes, everything felt wrong. Could he have come from the past? But that didn't make sense. Leo had only travelled to 1912. This man looked like he had come from even earlier. "What year is it?" the man asked, his voice growing more urgent. Leo took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "It's 2024. "You're in the present," he replied, though he wasn't sure he could even trust his own words anymore. What did the present even mean anymore? The stranger's face turned pale, and he staggered back as though he had been struck. "No, that's not possible. It's 1865. I was—" His voice trailed off as he looked around in utter disbelief. He started to back away from Leo, his hands shaking as he grasped at the doorframe for support. No, this is wrong. This can't be happening." Leo stepped forward, his mind racing. "What is going on?" He reached out. The man's eyes flashed with terror. He turned and bolted for the door, but Leo grabbed his arm just in time. "Stop! You'll hurt yourself!" Leo shouted. He raced forward, speeding toward the man twisted in Leo's grip, his face twisted in panic. "Get away from me!" he shouted, struggling. I can't be here. I have to go back. I need to go back to my time." His words came out in a frantic, disjointed rush. Leo was taken aback by the man's wild behaviour, but before he could react further, the man yanked his arm free and sprinted toward the open door. "Wait!" Leo called, but the man was already gone, disappearing into the night. Leo stood in the doorway for a moment, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The time machine had worked, but it had done something worse than he had ever imagined. It hadn't just brought him back to the present. It had torn open a rift, a hole in the fabric of time that allowed other people from other eras, to slip through. Leo's chest tightened as he realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. He had been so focused on the past, on fixing the timeline, that he hadn't considered the consequences. What if there were others? What if there were more people from different times, now wandering the present? His head throbbed with the implications. He had to find out. He couldn't ignore this. If the time machine was bringing people from different eras, it could destroy everything he knew. The world itself was at risk. The door slammed behind him, and Leo's heart skipped a beat as he heard footsteps. His instincts kicked in, and he quickly spun around, looking for a place to hide. Was there another one? But there was no one. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Was he imagining things? Or had the man really just disappeared into the night? Leo's pulse hammered in his ears as he rushed back to the time machine. He had to test it. He had to see if this anomaly could be stopped before it was too late. But as he looked at the blinking buttons, his breath hitched. Something was wrong. The machine was malfunctioning. Again, the time rift wasn't just open. It was growing. The realization hit Leo with full force. It wasn't just an accident. It was happening again. He cannot bear the thought of what might happen, and this time, he wasn't sure if he could stop it. Dr. Leo Sanders paced back and forth in his lab, his hands gripping his head as though the pressure of the situation could be contained in his mind. He had been running calculations in his head for hours, but there was no solution. The time machine was no longer a marvel of scientific achievement. It was a ticking bomb. The rift in time had grown larger. Every minute he spent trying to fix it only seemed to make things worse. What have I done? The thought echoed in his mind, each repetition like a hammer to his chest. The man who had appeared in his lab, the one from the past, hadn't been a coincidence. He was just the beginning. What if there were more? What if he wasn't the only one whose presence had torn through time? The door to the lab creaked open again, this time more slowly, cautiously. Leo whipped around, heart racing. Was it the man again? Or someone else from the past? Leo? A voice called, breaking his concentration. It was smooth, calm, and familiar. He turned to see Professor Kate Marshall, his colleague from the university, standing in the doorway. Her glasses reflected the dim light from the flickering lamps overhead. Kate was one of the few people Leo trusted with his work, someone who had been by his side for years, but now, in this moment, Leo wasn't sure he could trust anyone. "Kate!" Leo exclaimed, his voice filled with both relief and panic. "You've got to help me, there's no time. The machine, it's broken, and it's causing... Something terrible is happening." Kate raised an eyebrow, but stepped inside, her arms folded as she studied him. She was no stranger to Leo's chaotic nature, but this was different. She could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with concern. Leo rushed to explain, speaking quickly and barely making sense. He described the man who had appeared from another time, the destruction the time machine had caused, and how the rift in time was growing larger by the second. "This is unbelievable, Leo," Kate said, shaking her head, but she didn't dismiss him. "If this is true, we're in deep trouble." "I know," Leo shouted. "You've got to help me fix it. If this rift isn't closed, who knows what will happen? I might have already altered the past beyond recognition. I need to get to the source of the problem before everything collapses into chaos." Kate's expression softened. "You've always been driven by your curiosity, Leo. But you've pushed too far this time. You didn't consider the consequences. You didn't think about the risks." Leo knew she was right. But there was no turning back. The time machine had already opened a gateway, and with it, the dangers were just beginning. Suddenly, a loud crash from the hallway jolted them both. Leo and Kate exchanged a glance before rushing to the door. Time's on ward. As they stepped into the hallway, they saw a figure standing at the far end. The man, the one who had appeared in Leo's lab earlier, was back, but this time, something was different. His eyes were wide with terror, and his clothes were torn, as though he had been running from something. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his voice was barely audible as he shouted, "They're coming. You have to stop them. Now." Before either of them could respond, the man collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Leo knelt beside him, examining his wounds. What happened to him? What did he see? Leo murmured, his mind racing. Ponder, they're not the only ones who've been pulled through time, Kate said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with dread. Something is happening. Something worse than we imagined, said Alice. Leo stood up, his hands shaking as he helped Kate pull the man inside the lab. We have to figure out what this is, fast. If more people, dangerous people, are coming through, it could be catastrophic. Kate's eyes narrowed. Dangerous people? What do you mean? I'm not sure, but there's something wrong, and I think we're not alone in this. I think we're not alone in this. I said. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as they both worked to stabilize the man. But Leo's thoughts were elsewhere. He could feel it. The sense of impending doom, the weight of what he had unleashed. And it wasn't just the man from the past that terrified him. It was the unknown forces that might be coming. Suddenly, the lights in the lab flickered, and a low rumble seemed to reverberate through the walls. Leo glanced at the time machine, and for a brief moment it seemed to glow brighter, more unstable than ever before. The air around it felt charged, as if it was alive. But, Leo, what's happening? Kate asked, her voice quavering. Something's coming, Leo muttered. It's the rift. It's getting worse. We have to stop it before... The words caught in his throat as the door to the lab slammed open with a deafening bang. A figure stood in the doorway, a woman dressed in dark, weathered clothing, holding a weapon that looked out of place in the modern world. A sword, worn with age but sharp and deadly. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, and her presence seemed to pull the very air from the room. She stepped inside without hesitation, her gaze locking with Leo's. You shouldn't have tampered with time, the woman said, her voice cold and deliberate. Now you've opened the gates, and you're not the only ones who've been brought here. Behind her, Leo could see more figures emerging from the shadows. They were people from different eras, each one dressed in clothing that spoke of a time long past. A soldier from the 1600s, a Victorian aristocrat, a woman with the markings of an ancient civilization. Kate gasped. Who are they? They're the ones who've come through with the rift, Leo said, his voice strained. And they're not here to make friends. He looked up as they crossed the square, and then noticed Cassie. The woman with the sword stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. You have no idea what you've done, scientist. Time was not meant to be manipulated. Now, you will face the consequences. Leo could feel the weight of her words. His hands clenched into fists, but his mind raced. He had no idea how to fight these people, how to protect himself and Kate. The rift had torn through time, bringing with it forces far beyond his understanding, and now they were here. One of the soldiers stepped forward, a look of grim determination on his face. We've come to stop you, Leo Sanders. Your meddling has caused a fracture in time, and now the balance must be restored. Leo's heart pounded in his chest as the woman with the sword raised her weapon. You've opened the gates of hell, and now you must close them. The tension in the air was palpable, the stakes higher than Leo could have ever imagined. He had no choice now but to fight, to find a way to close the rift before the past, present, and future collided in a violent storm. But how? He had no answers, no plan. Only fear and desperation. Time, it seemed, had become his enemy. The lab was filled with an overwhelming tension, the hum of the time machine a constant, menacing reminder of the chaos Leo had unleashed. The figures who had stepped through the rift, people from a past long forgotten, stood like shadows in the doorway, their eyes filled with hostility and unspoken purpose. Leo's breath quickened as he glanced at Kate, who stood beside him, her face pale but determined. They had come for him. They had come for the time machine. And Leo knew with a sickening certainty that if he didn't act now, everything he had worked for, everything he had built, would be lost. His heart pounded as the woman with the sword took another step toward him. Her eyes were cold, calculating, as if she had already decided his fate. "You're not the first to try and control time, Dr. Sanders," she said, her voice smooth but filled with an underlying menace. "But you will be the last." Leo swallowed hard. His mind raced. He had no time to waste. The rift. The rift was still growing, and if he didn't find a way to close it, it would consume everything in its path. People from all over time were coming through, an endless flood of strangers, warriors, aristocrats, criminals, and all of them were dangerous. They had no place in his world, no place in the present, and they would stop at nothing to claim it for themselves. Leo turned to Kate, his eyes pleading. "We have to get to the core of the machine, Kate. I need to shut it down before it rips open the entire timeline." Kate nodded, but she was clearly scared. Her hands trembled as she grabbed a nearby wrench, ready to help him with whatever was coming next. "But how? How do we stop this?" "We have to get the power source," Leo replied, his voice tight with urgency. "It's in the core. It's the only way to reverse this, but we need to get to it before they do." The woman with the sword chuckled darkly. "You think you can stop us? Time is ours to control now. You've opened the gates, and we will make sure they stay open." Leo felt a surge of fear, but he quickly pushed it down. This is it, he thought. There was no turning back. He had made the choice to build the time machine, to push the boundaries of science. Now, he would have to face the consequences of that decision. As the figures in the doorway moved closer, Leo grabbed Kate's arm. "Go! I'll hold them off." "What?" Kate's voice cracked with disbelief. "Leo! No! You can't!" "I can!" Leo interrupted. "I have to. The machine needs me to make the final adjustment. Just get to the power source. I'll take care of them." Kate hesitated, her face torn between fear and loyalty. But Leo didn't have time to argue. The figures were closing in, and the woman with the sword was now only a few feet away, her gaze unwavering. "Do you truly believe you can fight time itself?" the woman asked, her voice now tinged with something darker. "It will destroy you." "I don't care," Leo shouted, his voice echoing in the lab. "I'll fight for this world. I'll fight for the future." Without another word, Kate turned and dashed toward the time machine's core. Leo's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't look back. Instead, he stepped forward to face the woman with the sword, his fists clenched and ready. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The flickering lights, the distant hum of the time machine, even the air around them seemed to hold its breath. Leo could feel the power of the rift surging around him. It was a presence, a tangible force that vibrated through his bones. The more he stood there, the more it became clear. If he didn't act, if he didn't stop the machine now, it would be the end of everything. The woman lunged at him with a terrifying speed, her sword slicing through the air. Leo barely managed to dodge, the blade missing him by mere inches. He stumbled back, his heart racing, but his mind was focused. He couldn't let this woman stop him. He couldn't let her, or anyone else, destroy everything he had worked for. As she swung the sword again, Leo ducked and scrambled to his feet, the heat of the blade grazing his skin. The room seemed to close in on him. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. His body was covered in a thin sheen of sweat, but his focus never wavered. He had to stop her. He had to stop them all. He saw Kate working furiously near the core, her hands moving quickly as she tried to access the power source, but it was clear that the woman was far more skilled in combat. Leo couldn't risk her getting hurt. "I won't let this happen." Leo lunged forward, grabbing a nearby piece of equipment, a heavy wrench. With all the strength he could muster, he swung it toward the woman. She blocked it with ease, the sword ringing against the metal. But Leo was faster than he had ever been before. The adrenaline surged through him as he darted to the side and, with a desperate cry, knocked the sword from her hand. The woman staggered back in shock, momentarily disoriented. It was all the opening Leo needed. He threw the wrench aside and charged at her, using his full weight to knock her to the ground. "You can't stop me," she gasped, struggling beneath him. Another of his fingers pressed against her entrance. Leo's chest heaved as he pinned her down. "You're wrong. I can and I will." Behind him, he heard the time machine power up with a deafening roar. It was too late for second thoughts. Leo didn't know what the rift would do once it was shut down, but he had no other choice. He had to take the risk. The future depended on it. The world depended on it. Leo Antoine volé, anarchistak, maître mère, mais attends Valérie. "Kate!" Leo shouted over his shoulder. "I need you to cut the power. Now." Crying, Kate's voice was strained but determined. "I'm doing it, Leo. Hold on." Leo turned back to the woman beneath him. "This is over." Before she could respond, there was a blinding flash of light, and the room shook violently, sending them all sprawling to the ground. The air crackled with electricity, and for a moment, everything felt like it was stretching, warping, into something unrecognizable. Then, as quickly as it had started, the shaking stopped. Leo struggled to his feet, his mind reeling from the force of the explosion. The time machine was silent now. The rift was gone. The figures who had emerged from it were gone. The past, the present, and the future were, finally, sealed. Kate approached slowly, her face pale but relieved. "Leo, did it work?" Leo made a feint. Leo's breath caught in his throat as he glanced at the machine. It was still there, still intact, but the power was gone. The rift was sealed. The timeline was intact. They had done it. He collapsed to his knees, exhaustion taking over as the weight of everything they had just done settled in. His hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his brow. "It's over," he whispered. The woman from the past, now powerless, lay still on the floor, her sword no longer a threat. Leo had won. The rift was closed, and the world was safe. But at what cost? As Leo and Kate stood there, the quiet aftermath of their victory settling in, the only sound left was the gentle hum of the now still time machine. Time had been saved, but at a price, and Leo knew, deep down, that even if the rift had been closed, there would always be consequences. Always. The rift that had threatened to tear the fabric of time apart was gone, sealed for good. But as Leo glanced around the room, his thoughts raced. Had it really worked? Was time truly restored? He couldn't shake the nagging doubt in the pit of his stomach. The woman with the sword, the warriors from the past, all the chaos they had unleashed. It was over, for now. But at what cost? Kate approached him slowly, her face pale but determined. Her eyes searched his face, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They had been through too much in such a short time, and words felt inadequate now. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken emotions. Finally, Kate spoke. "It's over. We did it, Leo. The rift is closed. The timeline. It's intact. Leo nodded, his heart still pounding. He had saved the world. He had stopped the flood of time travelers. But something deep inside him felt hollow. The cost of his actions, the dangers they had faced, it had all been too much. The faces of the people who had come through the rift, the lives he had disrupted, haunted him. He wasn't sure if he would ever be able to reconcile with the consequences. That's when Gerald, "Do you think it's really over?" Leo asked quietly, his voice betraying the uncertainty he felt. "I mean, can we trust that it's fixed?" Anthony looked around his suite of rooms. Before answering, Kate's eyes softened and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "I don't know, Leo, but we've done what we could. We've sealed the rift, and if anyone can rebuild what's left, it's us." Leo's gaze dropped to the floor. He was grateful for her support, but the guilt still gnawed at him. The timeline, the fabric of history, how many lives had he altered? How many futures had been lost, or changed irreparably because of his reckless ambition? A sudden noise behind them jolted Leo out of his thoughts. He turned sharply, ready for whatever threat might still lurk. But to his surprise, the woman with the sword, the leader of the time travelers, was stirring. She had been unconscious since the time machine's shutdown, and now she was slowly pushing herself up, her eyes narrowing as she glared at Leo. "Don't think you've won, Dr. Sanders," she spat, her voice hoarse but filled with venom. "You may have closed the rift, but you've only delayed the inevitable. Time will find a way to break through again." Leo stepped forward, his body tense. He had expected this. The woman, like all the others, was from a time long past, one in which power and control meant everything. She wasn't going to accept defeat easily. "I've stopped it," Leo said, his voice firm. "The rift is closed, and you have no power here anymore." The woman's lip curled into a bitter smile. "You think you understand time, but you don't. It's not just something you can control with machines and calculations. Time is alive, and it will fight back." Kate stepped beside Leo, her gaze unwavering. "You're wrong. We've sealed it. You and your people. Your war is over." The woman paused, considering Kate's words. Her eyes flickered, a moment of vulnerability flashing across her face. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she seemed to deflate, her body slumping in resignation. "You're right," she muttered. "It's over for now. But don't think this is the end. There are others, people like me, who will keep trying, and one day someone will open that door again." Duncan smiled. Leo nodded, his expression hardening. "Then we'll be ready. We'll make sure it doesn't happen again." The woman didn't respond. She simply looked away, her gaze distant. Leo wasn't sure if she was simply defeated or if she was plotting her next move, but in that moment, he didn't care. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of relief. As the woman was escorted out of the lab by security, arranged by Kate, who had quickly called for backup, the room seemed to grow quieter. The echoes of battle faded, leaving only the remnants of their work. Leo looked over at Kate, who was now sitting on a nearby table, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We did it, didn't we?" Leo asked, though it was more a statement than a question. Kate gave him a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, we stopped the rift. We saved the world, Leo." But her voice trailed off, and Leo felt a pang of unease. He knew what was coming. "But what?" he pressed, stepping closer. "But what happens now?" Kate said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "What happens to all the people who came through? The soldiers, the thieves, the nobility? Do we just send them back to their time? What if they don't belong there anymore? Leo ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He hadn't considered the aftermath of their actions. The rift had been closed, but the consequences of tampering with time were far-reaching. What if they had changed things forever? What if the people who had come through couldn't go back? Or worse, what if they were stranded in the wrong time, their presence causing chaos all over again? Kate seemed to read his mind. Leo, do you think the world will ever be the same? We've already altered so much. We've broken time. How do we fix it? Leo took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I don't know, but we'll figure it out. Together, there was a long pause before Kate spoke again. And what about you? After all of this, after everything you've been through, are you okay? Leo didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he didn't know. He felt hollow inside, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. But there was one thing he knew for certain. I'll be okay, he said softly. I have to be. Kate nodded, her gaze softening. You've been through a lot, Leo. But you're not alone anymore. We'll make it right. We'll rebuild. And in that moment, Leo realized that, despite everything, there was hope. They had survived the impossible. They had stopped the rift, and now, together, they would face whatever came next. Time might be broken, but it wasn't beyond repair. And as long as they had each other, they would find a way to fix it, one piece at a time. As they stood there, side by side, the hum of the time machine now just a distant memory, Leo made a promise to himself. No matter what the future held, he would be ready. He had learned the hard way that time was not something to be played with, but it was something that could be shaped by those who were brave enough to face its consequences. Now is the time, and that, he realized, was the greatest lesson of all. The lab was quiet now. The chaos that had erupted only days earlier had settled into a somber calm. The time machine, once the heart of the storm, sat dormant in the corner, its lights dimmed, its power exhausted. The rift was closed. The danger had passed, for the moment, but there was still much to be done. Leo sat at the workbench, his hands still shaking slightly from the tension of the last few days. His mind replayed the events over and over. The rift opening, the chaos that followed, the warriors and time travelers who had stepped into the present. He had been so sure that his invention was the answer, but he had learned just how fragile time really was. And yet, despite everything that had gone wrong, he had managed to fix it, to undo the damage. But at what cost? Kate walked into the lab, a mug of steaming coffee in hand. Her eyes met Leo's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It had been a long road to get here, and the weight of everything they had gone through was still heavy in the air. How are you holding up? Kate finally asked, her voice soft but concerned. Leo glanced up, his face weary but determined. I'm okay, he said, his voice betraying the exhaustion he felt. It's just hard to process everything. We closed the rift, we stopped the chaos, but there's so much I still don't understand. Kate nodded, her expression thoughtful. She set the coffee down in front of him, her hands resting on the table. I know, this whole thing, it's more complicated than we could have imagined. But we did it, Leo. We made it through. Leo picked up the coffee, feeling the warmth seep into his cold hands. He stared at the mug, his mind lost in thought. He had always been driven by the desire to understand, to control, to fix what was broken. But in his quest to control time, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Do you think we did the right thing? Leo asked quietly, I mean, closing the rift was necessary, but we changed so much. How do we know we didn't make things worse? Kate sat down next to him, her eyes meeting his with a steady gaze. I think the real question is, what happens next? We've fixed the immediate danger, but we've opened a new chapter. We can't predict the future, Leo, but we can shape it. Leo let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders finally beginning to ease. He looked at Kate, her face filled with quiet resolve. For the first time since they had closed the rift, Leo felt a sense of peace. They had done the impossible, and they had done it together. I don't know what the future holds, Leo admitted, but I do know that I can't do this alone. I need you, Kate. Kate gave him a small smile, her eyes warm. You've never been alone, Leo. Not really. We've always been in this together. As the words hung in the air, a sense of finality settled over them. The time machine was no longer a threat. The rift was closed. The warriors from the past had been returned to their own time, and the chaos had been quelled. But what about the consequences? What about the people whose lives had been disrupted by their meddling with time? Lord of the Rings' words had been disrupted by their meddling with time. Leo had no answers, but he did have hope. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, debriefing, and coordinating efforts to return the displaced time travelers to their rightful eras. Leo worked tirelessly alongside Kate, who was as dedicated as ever to making sure the world returned to some semblance of normal. The time machine was carefully dismantled, its parts studied and analysed for any residual energy that might pose a threat. And though the danger had passed, Leo could not shake the feeling that time was still something to be wary of. As weeks turned into months, life began to return to a sense of normalcy. The world had not ended, and the rift had been sealed. But the impact of their actions lingered. The faces of the people who had been pulled from the past, the warriors and scholars, haunted Leo. Had they truly returned to the right time? Had they been forever changed by their time in the present? Kiefer and Paul finally had a daughter, Livy. He called her Leah. He would never know the answers to those questions. But he had learned an important lesson. One day, as he stood in front of the dismantled time machine, Kate approached him with a smile. "You're thinking too much again," she said, her tone light but filled with warmth. It was one of his favourite days, and everything about the meeting was perfect in his eyes. Leo looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to smile. "Yeah, I guess I am. But it's hard not to. I keep wondering what comes next. What do we do now?" Kate reached out and touched his shoulder gently. "We move forward, Leo. We've already changed the course of history. Now we have to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." Leo nodded, the weight of his decision finally lifting. "I think you're right. It's time to stop worrying about what we can't control and focus on what we can." And so, with Kate by his side, Leo decided to let go of his fears. He would never forget the lessons he had learned, the dangers of playing with time, the consequences of their actions, and the importance of being mindful of the future. But he also knew that he couldn't change the past. All he could do was learn from it and move forward. The lab, once a place of chaos and uncertainty, had become a place of healing. Leo and Kate continued their work, this time with a new understanding of the responsibility they carried. They knew that time could never truly be controlled, but they could shape the future by the choices they made today. In the end, Leo had achieved his goal. He had closed the rift and stopped the chaos. But more importantly, he had learned the value of companionship, the power of teamwork, and the importance of accepting the unknown. He had learned that even the greatest minds couldn't predict every outcome, but they could always choose to do the right thing in the face of uncertainty. As he looked at the dismantled time machine, Leo smiled. He had made mistakes, but he had also grown, and that was the most important lesson of all. Leo's journey had begun with a desire to control time, to shape the past, present, and future. But through the chaos and destruction caused by his own ambition, he had learned that time was not something to be bent to his will. The true lesson was not in controlling time, but in understanding it, in learning to live with the consequences of his actions and accepting the uncertainty of the future. In the end, Leo's greatest achievement was not the closing of the rift, but the growth he had experienced. He had learned the importance of balance, of teamwork, and of the humility required to accept that not everything could be fixed. He had learned that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, the future was still something they could shape together, and that was enough.